In the shadowed alleyways of Victorian London, where gaslight barely pierced the autumn mist, a duke's life would change forever. What began as a chance encounter with a woman's desperate tears would unravel into a tale of betrayal, redemption, and a love that defied every rule of society. For when Alexander Whitmore, the seventh Duke of Ashford, offered his handkerchief to a stranger in wedding silk, he had no idea he was embracing his destiny. But some moments are written in the stars, and this was one that would echo through the grand ballrooms and whispered scandals of an entire season. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has travelled. Lady Evangeline Fairfax had always known her life was not her own. From the moment she drew her first breath in the opulent nursery of Fairfax Manor, her path had been carved in marble as surely as the family crest adorning the estate's grand entrance. At 22, she possessed the ethereal beauty that graced the finest portraits, auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, emerald eyes that sparkled with intelligence she was never permitted to display, and a spirit that yearned for freedom within the confines of her gilded prison. The morning of her wedding dawned grey and foreboding over the sprawling grounds of her family's Yorkshire estate. Evangeline stood before the towering windows of her chambers, watching the servants scurry about like ants, preparing for the arrival of London's most distinguished guests. Today, she would become the Countess of Blackwood, wife to Reginald Ashworth, heir to one of England's most powerful families. "You look positively radiant, my dear," her mother, Lady Margaret Fairfax, declared as she swept into the room, her silk skirts rustling with authority. "The Ashworth family will be most pleased with this union. Think of the connections, the influence, the security you'll provide for our family's future." Evangeline's reflection stared back at her from the ornate mirror, draped in ivory silk and Belgian lace that had cost more than most families earned in a year. The gown was exquisite, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that made her appear every inch the perfect aristocratic bride. Yet beneath the finery, her heart hammered with a desperate rhythm that spoke of dreams unfulfilled and choices unmade. "Mother," she began tentatively, "do you think Lord Blackwood truly cares for me? We've spent so little time together, and when we do speak, he seems more interested in discussing my dowry than my thoughts." Lady Margaret's laugh was sharp as crystal. "Darling child, love is a luxury for those without responsibility. You are a Fairfax. Your duty is to your family, your station, and the continuation of our bloodline. Lord Blackwood is handsome, wealthy, and well-connected. What more could any sensible woman desire? But Evangeline had read the forbidden novels hidden beneath her mattress, had dreamed of conversations that lasted until dawn, of a man who would see her mind as beautiful as her face. She had imagined love as something wild and consuming, not the cold calculation that had arranged her future. The hours passed in a blur of preparations. Her lady's maid, Sarah, dressed her hair in an elaborate style befitting a countess, weaving pearls through the auburn waves. The wedding gown, with its sweeping train and delicate beadwork, transformed her into a vision of aristocratic perfection. Yet with each layer of silk and each strand of pearls, Evangeline felt herself disappearing, becoming nothing more than an ornament in someone else's grand design. As the afternoon sun began its descent, carriages arrived bearing the cream of London society. Through her window, Evangeline watched Lord Blackwood emerge from his family's magnificent coach, his tall frame impeccably dressed in morning coat and top hat. Reginald Ashworth was undeniably handsome, with sharp features and an air of supreme confidence that commanded attention wherever he went. Yet something in his pale blue eyes had always left her feeling cold, as though she were being appraised rather than admired. "The guests are assembled," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "Oh, my lady, you look like something from a fairy tale." But as Evangeline descended the grand staircase toward the chapel where her future awaited, She couldn't shake the feeling that this fairy tale was missing its most essential element. Where was the prince who would love her for her wit, her dreams, her secret longings? Instead, she walked toward a man who saw her as nothing more than a beautiful acquisition, a prize to be displayed in his collection of fine things. The chapel doors loomed before her, and beyond them waited a life of predetermined conversations, scheduled affections, and a love that would never be allowed to bloom. As her father took her arm, his chest swelling with pride at the advantageous match he had secured, Evangeline wondered if this hollow ache in her chest would ever fade, or if she was destined to spend her life as a beautiful ghost haunting someone else's dreams. What she didn't know was that in just a few hours, her carefully orchestrated world would shatter like spun glass, and in that destruction, she would discover something far more precious than all the security her family's arrangement could provide. But first, she had to walk through those chapel doors and face the moment that would change everything. The chapel of Fairfax Manor had been transformed into a cathedral of dreams. Its ancient stone walls, adorned with cascades of white roses and trailing ivy that seemed to breathe life into the sacred space. Hundreds of candles flickered like earthbound stars, casting dancing shadows across the faces of London's most distinguished families. The air was thick with the perfume of hothouse flowers and the weight of expectation, as 300 guests turned in their pews to witness what society had deemed the wedding of the season. Evangeline's heart thundered beneath her corseted bodice as she glided down the aisle on her father's arm, her silk train whispering secrets against the ancient flagstones. The faces that turned toward her were a blur of satisfied smiles and calculating eyes, mothers mentally cataloguing every detail of her gown for their own daughters' future weddings, fathers nodding approval at the strategic alliance being forged before their eyes. At the altar, Lord Blackwood stood with military precision, his mourning coat tailored to perfection, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight. Yet as Evangeline drew closer, she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. His pale blue eyes, which should have been fixed upon his approaching bride with love, or at least satisfaction, kept darting toward the front pew where her younger sister Charlotte sat. Charlotte, barely 19 and possessed of the same Fairfax beauty, but with a calculating gleam that Evangeline had never recognized until this moment, wore a gown of deep sapphire that complemented her golden hair and cornflower blue eyes. She sat with perfect posture, her fan fluttering coquettishly, and when Lord Blackwood's gaze found hers, she offered the slightest of smiles, intimate, knowing, and utterly devastating. The ceremony began with the ancient words that had bound countless couples before them, but Evangeline felt as though she were drowning in a sea of silk and expectation. The Archbishop's voice seemed to come from a great distance as he spoke of love, honor, and fidelity, words that felt increasingly hollow with each stolen glance between her intended husband and her sister. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop intoned, his voice echoing through the chapel, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Lord Reginald Ashworth and Lady Evangeline Fairfax in holy matrimony." But as the ceremony progressed toward the moment of vows, something shifted in the atmosphere. Lord Blackwood's composure, which had been flawless throughout their courtship, began to crack like a facade of ice in spring sunlight. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for hers, and when their eyes met, she saw not love or even duty, but a kind of desperate panic. "Lord Blackwood," the Archbishop prompted gently, "do you take Lady Evangeline to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 300 guests held their collective breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Evangeline felt the world tilt on its axis as she watched her future husband's face transform from uncertainty to something approaching anguish. Lord Blackwood began, his voice cracking like a schoolboy's. His gaze found Charlotte again, and in that look, Evangeline saw the truth that would shatter her world. "I cannot." The words fell into the chapel like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Gasps echoed off the ancient walls, and the rustle of silk grew urgent as guests leaned forward, desperate to witness every moment of the unfolding scandal. "I beg your pardon," the Archbishop stammered, his prayer book trembling in his hands. Lord Blackwood stepped back from the altar, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and desperate relief. "I cannot marry Lady Evangeline," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My heart belongs to another." The chapel erupted in a cacophony of whispers and barely suppressed exclamations. Lady Margaret Fairfax rose from her seat like an avenging angel, her face white with fury and humiliation. "Reginald, what is the meaning of this outrage?" But Lord Blackwood's attention was fixed entirely on Charlotte, who had risen from her seat with a grace that seemed almost choreographed. "Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, "I should have spoken sooner. I should have been honest about my feelings from the beginning." Charlotte moved toward the altar with the fluid grace of a dancer, her sapphire gown catching the candlelight like captured starlight. "Reginald," she whispered, but her voice carried in the acoustics of the chapel, ensuring that every guest could hear her words. "I thought you would never find the courage to speak." The truth hit Evangeline like a physical blow. This was not a moment of sudden realization or desperate passion. This was a carefully orchestrated betrayal. The secret glances, the whispered conversations she had dismissed as sibling confidences, the way Charlotte had insisted on helping plan the wedding down to the smallest detail. Her own sister had been conducting an affair with her intended husband, and they had chosen this moment, this sacred space filled with witnesses, to reveal their deception. "You knew," Evangeline whispered, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the chapel. "You both knew, and you let me believe." Lord Blackwood had the grace to look ashamed, but Charlotte's expression held no remorse, only a kind of triumphant satisfaction. "Evangeline," she said with false sweetness, "surely you must have realized that Reginald and I were better suited. We share the same interests, the same social circles. You've always been too bookish for someone of his standing." The cruelty of the words, delivered with such casual dismissal, sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the congregation. Even in a society accustomed to arranged marriages and strategic alliances, the public humiliation of a bride at the altar was beyond the pale. Evangeline felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes upon her, some filled with pity, others with the hungry gleam of those who fed on scandal. Her father stood frozen beside her, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and the dawning realization of social ruin. Her mother had sunk back into her pew, her fan working frantically as she struggled to process the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before her. "The engagement between our families," Lord Blackwood continued, addressing Evangeline's father with newfound confidence, "was arranged when Charlotte was too young to be considered. But she is of age now, and our affection has grown beyond what either of us expected. I formally request permission to court Lady Charlotte instead." The audacity of the request sent another wave of gasps through the chapel. To jilt one sister at the altar and immediately request the hand of another was a scandal that would be discussed in drawing rooms across London for years to come. Evangeline stood frozen in her wedding gown, feeling like a statue carved from ice and abandonment. The flowers in her hair suddenly felt heavy as stones, the silk of her dress suffocating as a shroud. Around her, the chapel that had been transformed into a temple of love now felt like a mausoleum of dreams. But as the initial shock began to wear off, something else stirred within her, not the devastation she expected, but a strange, unexpected sense of liberation. The golden cage that had confined her for 22 years had just burst open, and though the freedom was terrifying, it was also intoxicating. Without a word, Evangeline gathered her silk skirts and walked with dignity toward the chapel doors. her head held high despite the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. Behind her, the chaos continued. Her father's voice raised in fury, her mother's sobs, and the excited chatter of guests who had just witnessed the social event of the decade. As she stepped out of the chapel into the grey afternoon, Evangeline realized that her life as she had known it was over. But perhaps, she thought, as she began to run across the grounds of her family estate, her real life was just beginning. The question was, did she have the courage to discover who she truly was beneath all the silk and expectations? The answer to that question lay waiting in the shadowed streets of London, where a duke with kind eyes and a gentle heart would soon offer her not just comfort, but the chance to rewrite her entire story. The cobblestones of Belgravia gleamed wet with November rain as Evangeline's carriage drew to a halt before the elegant townhouse of Lady Agatha Pemberton. 3 weeks had passed since the catastrophe at Fairfax Manor. 3 weeks during which Evangeline had existed in a strange limbo between her old life and whatever uncertain future awaited her. The scandal had spread through London society like wildfire, making her name synonymous with public humiliation and her family's reputation a subject of whispered speculation in every drawing room from Mayfair to Kensington. Lady Agatha, her father's unmarried sister, had extended the invitation with characteristic directness. "Come to London, child. Hide in Yorkshire if you must lick your wounds, but don't you dare let them bury you alive." At 55, Lady Agatha was everything a proper Victorian lady should not be: outspoken, independent, and utterly uninterested in society's opinion of her choices. She had never married, preferring to travel the world and collect experiences rather than a husband, and her Belgravia home served as an unofficial salon for artists, writers, and intellectuals who found the traditional social circles stifling. As Evangeline stepped from the carriage, her black travelling dress a stark contrast to the ivory silk that had become her symbol of shame, she felt the weight of curious eyes from neighbouring windows. Even here, in the relative anonymity of London, her story had preceded her. The jilted bride, the woman whose own sister had stolen her intended husband at the altar, she had become a cautionary tale, a source of both pity and entertainment. "Evangeline, my dear girl." Lady Agatha appeared at the door before the butler could announce her arrival. Her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her violet eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. Unlike the rest of the family, she showed no signs of embarrassment or shame at her niece's presence. "Come in from this dreadful weather. London in November is punishment enough without standing about in the rain." The interior of Lady Agatha's home was a revelation. Where Fairfax Manor had been all heavy furniture and ancestral portraits glowering from gilded frames, this house breathed with life and colour. Books lined every available wall. Paintings from unknown artists hung beside sketches from famous ones, and comfortable chairs were arranged in intimate groupings that invited conversation rather than formal posturing. "I've prepared the blue room for you," Lady Agatha said, leading Evangeline up a staircase adorned with photographs from her travels: the pyramids of Egypt, the canals of Venice, the mountains of Switzerland. "It has the best light for reading, and I suspect you'll be doing quite a lot of that while you decide what comes next." "What comes next?" Evangeline repeated, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. For 22 years, what came next had always been predetermined. Lessons, then a season, then marriage, then children, then the gradual fade into respectable matronhood. "I'm not certain there is a next for someone like me." Lady Agatha stopped on the landing and turned to face her niece, her expression fierce with determination. "Someone like you? You mean an intelligent, beautiful young woman who has been freed from a marriage that would have slowly strangled her spirit? My dear child, you speak as though your life is over when it has only just begun." No, the blue room was indeed beautiful, with tall windows overlooking a small garden where the last roses of autumn clung stubbornly to their stems despite the approaching winter. Evangeline sank into a chair by the window, feeling the exhaustion of the past weeks settle into her bones like lead. "The whole of London knows what happened," she said quietly. "Charlotte and Reginald were married last week in a small ceremony. Mother writes that they seem quite happy together, and that perhaps it was all for the best. Father has forbidden anyone to mention my name in his presence." "Your father is a fool," Lady Agatha said with characteristic bluntness, settling into the chair opposite her niece. "And your mother is a coward. As for Charlotte and Reginald, they deserve each other. Two shallow creatures who mistake calculation for passion. You, my dear, deserve so much more." Over the following days, Lady Agatha began the delicate work of coaxing Evangeline back to life. She introduced her to a world that existed parallel to the one she had always known, a London where women attended lectures on scientific discoveries, where conversations centered on ideas rather than gossip, where intelligence was valued over bloodlines. "Tonight," Lady Agatha announced one evening as they sat by the fire, "we're attending a lecture at the Royal Institution. Professor Hartwell is speaking on the archaeological discoveries in Egypt. Fascinating man. He's just returned from 3 years in Cairo." Evangeline looked up from the book she had been reading, one of many that Lady Agatha had pressed upon her. "Aunt, I couldn't possibly. What if someone recognizes me? What if the sky falls?" Lady Agatha interrupted with a laugh. "My dear girl, you cannot spend the rest of your life hiding in this house, no matter how comfortable it may be. Besides, the people who attend these lectures are far too interested in expanding their minds to waste time on society gossip." The Royal Institution was a revelation. The lecture hall buzzed with animated conversation as men and women discussed theories and discoveries with equal passion. Evangeline found herself swept up in the excitement, her mind awakening from the stupor of the past weeks as Professor Hartwell described the wonders hidden beneath Egyptian sands. "The hieroglyphs tell us stories," he was saying, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "not just of kings and queens, but of ordinary people, their hopes, their fears, their daily lives. Each symbol is a window into a civilization that understood the power of preserving human experience for future generations." As the lecture concluded and the audience began to disperse, Evangeline found herself reluctant to leave. For the first time in weeks, she had forgotten to be ashamed, forgotten to worry about whispered conversations and pitying glances. She had simply been present, engaged, alive. "Lady Pemberton," a warm voice said behind them, and they turned to see a tall man with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes approaching. "I hoped I might see you this evening." "Dr. Reed," Lady Agatha replied with obvious pleasure. "How wonderful. Evangeline, I'd like you to meet Dr. Elias Reed. He's just returned from establishing a medical clinic in the East End. Elias, this is my niece, Lady Evangeline Fairfax." Dr. Reed bowed politely, but there was something in his manner that set him apart from the men Evangeline had known. He looked directly at her when he spoke, as though her thoughts and opinions mattered, as though she were more than an ornament to be admired. "Lady Fairfax," he said, "I hope you enjoyed Professor Hartwell's lecture. I noticed you taking notes. Are you interested in archaeology?" The simple question, asked without condescension or surprise, nearly brought tears to Evangeline's eyes. When had anyone last asked her about her interests? "Very much so," she managed. "The idea that we can understand so much about people who lived thousands of years ago through the objects they left behind, it's remarkable." "Indeed it is," Dr. Reed agreed, his eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "I've always thought that medicine and archaeology have much in common. Both seek to understand the human condition, whether in the present or the past." As they walked toward the exit, Dr. Reed continued to engage Evangeline in conversation about the lecture, about books she had read, about ideas that had captured her imagination. He spoke to her as an equal, as someone whose thoughts were worth hearing, and for the first time since the disaster at the altar, Evangeline felt like herself again. "Dr. Reed has done remarkable work in the East End," Lady Agatha explained as they waited for their carriage. "He's established a clinic that serves the poorest families, often without payment. It's exactly the sort of practical application of medical knowledge that makes a real difference in people's lives." "It sounds wonderful," Evangeline said, and meant it. "It must be gratifying to know that your work has such immediate impact." "It is," Dr. Reed replied, "though I confess I sometimes feel overwhelmed by the scope of the need. There are so many families struggling with illness and poverty, and so few resources to help them." As their carriage arrived, Dr. Reed helped both ladies inside with the easy courtesy of a man accustomed to treating all people with respect, regardless of their station. "Lady Pemberton, Lady Fairfax, it has been a pleasure. I hope we might meet again soon." As they drove through the gaslit streets of London, Evangeline found herself thinking not about the humiliation she had endured, but about the warmth in Dr. Reed's eyes when he spoke of his work, about the way he had listened to her opinions as though they mattered. For the first time in her life, she had met a man who seemed to value substance over superficiality, who looked at her and saw not a title or a dowry, but a person worth knowing. "He's a good man," Lady Agatha said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "The sort who sees people for who they truly are, rather than what society expects them to be." And that night, as Evangeline lay in the blue room, listening to the sounds of London settling into sleep, she felt something she had not experienced in weeks: hope. Perhaps Lady Agatha was right. Perhaps her life was not over, but beginning. Perhaps the woman who had been left at the altar was not the end of her story, but merely the first chapter of something far more meaningful. But could she find the courage to write that new chapter? And what would it cost her to step fully into a world where her choices were her own? The grand ballroom of Pemberton House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected infinitely in the crystal chandeliers that hung like captured stars above London's most progressive society. Lady Agatha's annual Christmas charity gala had become legendary, not for the usual display of wealth and status that characterized most social events, but for its unique blend of philanthropy and intellectual discourse. Tonight, the cream of London's artistic, scientific and medical communities mingled with the more enlightened members of the aristocracy, all united in support of Dr. Reed's East End Clinic and similar charitable endeavours. Evangeline stood at the top of the marble staircase, her reflection caught in the gilt-framed mirror that dominated the landing. 6 weeks of Lady Agatha's gentle guidance had transformed her from a broken woman into someone she barely recognized, someone she was only beginning to understand. Gone was the pale, ethereal beauty who had walked down the aisle in ivory silk. In its place stood a woman of quiet confidence, her auburn hair arranged in a sophisticated style that framed her face without hiding her intelligent green eyes, her gown of deep emerald silk, chosen not to please others, but because it made her feel powerful and alive. "You look magnificent, my dear," Lady Agatha said, appearing beside her in a rustle of midnight blue taffeta. "Are you ready to remind London society that Lady Evangeline Fairfax is very much alive and thriving?" Evangeline's heart fluttered with nervous energy, but beneath the anxiety lay something stronger: anticipation. "I believe I am, Aunt. For the first time in my life, I feel ready to be seen for who I truly am, rather than who others expect me to be." As they descended the staircase together, Evangeline was acutely aware of the moment when conversations paused and heads turned. She had expected this. The curiosity, the whispered speculations, the mixture of pity and fascination that her presence would inevitably provoke. But instead of shrinking from the attention as she once would have, she met each gaze with calm dignity, her chin raised and her smile serene. Lady Evangeline, Lord Pemberton, Lady Agatha's nephew and the evening's co-host, approached with obvious relief. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. I do hope you'll allow me to introduce you to some of our guests. There are several people here tonight who share your interest in archaeological discoveries. As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself engaged in conversations that stimulated her mind in ways she had never experienced. She discussed the latest excavations in Pompeii with a renowned archaeologist, debated the merits of different educational philosophies with a pioneering female educator, and listened with fascination as a young artist described her revolutionary approach to portraiture. Lady Fairfax, Dr. Reed's familiar voice drew her attention, and she turned to find him approaching with 2 glasses of champagne, his evening dress impeccable, but somehow less important than the warmth in his brown eyes. "I was hoping to find you here tonight. Lady Pemberton mentioned you've been attending lectures at the Royal Institution." "Dr. Reed," she replied, accepting the champagne with a smile that felt entirely natural. "Yes, I've discovered a passion for learning that I never knew I possessed. Your lecture last week on public health initiatives was particularly enlightening." "You attended my lecture?" His surprise was genuine and touching. "I must confess, I was nervous about speaking to such a distinguished audience. Medical practice in the East End is rather different from the theoretical discussions that usually take place in those hallowed halls." "That's precisely what made it so compelling," Evangeline said earnestly. "You spoke about real people, real problems, real solutions. It was refreshing to hear someone discuss how knowledge can be applied to improve actual lives, rather than simply to impress other academics." As they talked, Evangeline became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere around them. Conversations grew quieter, glances more pointed, and she realized that their interaction was being observed with intense interest. The idea of the jilted bride engaging in animated conversation with an eligible gentleman was clearly providing entertainment for those who fed on social drama. "Dr. Reed," a familiar voice cut through their conversation like a blade through silk, and Evangeline's blood turned to ice as she turned to see Lord Blackwood approaching, Charlotte on his arm like a beautiful poisonous flower. "How unexpected to see you here. I wasn't aware that medical men moved in such elevated circles." The insult was delivered with the casual cruelty that Evangeline remembered all too well, but Dr. Reed's response was measured and dignified. "Lord Blackwood, Lady Blackwood," he said with a polite nod. "I'm here as a guest of Lady Pemberton, who has been generous enough to support the clinic's work among London's most vulnerable populations." Charlotte, resplendent in rose silk that complemented her golden beauty, smiled with the same calculating sweetness that had once fooled Evangeline into thinking her sister cared for her welfare. "How noble of you, Dr. Reed, though I must say it seems rather ambitious for someone of your background to aspire to such company." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Evangeline felt something fierce and protective rise within her chest. "Dr. Reed's background," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the sudden hush that had fallen over their corner of the ballroom, "is one of service, education, and genuine accomplishment. I find that infinitely more impressive than inherited titles and unearned privilege." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Charlotte's blue eyes flashed with something dangerous, while Lord Blackwood's face flushed with the particular shade of red that indicated wounded pride. Around them, other guests had stopped pretending not to listen, their attention focused entirely on the unfolding drama. "My dear Evangeline," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I do hope you're not allowing your recent disappointments to cloud your judgment about appropriate social connections. After all, we wouldn't want you to make another unfortunate choice." The cruelty of the reference to the wedding disaster sent a murmur through the watching crowd, but instead of the devastation Charlotte clearly expected, Evangeline felt only a cold, clear anger that sharpened her thoughts like a blade. "You're quite right, Charlotte," she replied with perfect composure. "I have learned to be much more discerning about the character of those I allow into my life. I've discovered that true worth has very little to do with titles or social position, and everything to do with integrity, compassion, and genuine accomplishment." Dr. Reed stepped slightly closer to her side, not possessively, but supportively, and the gesture was not lost on the watching crowd. "Lady Fairfax," he said quietly, "perhaps we might continue our conversation about the archaeological exhibition. I believe you mentioned wanting to see the Egyptian artifacts that arrived last week." "Indeed," Evangeline replied, grateful for his tactful offer of escape. But before they could move away, Lord Blackwood's voice stopped them. "Dr. Reed," he said, his tone carrying the particular arrogance that came from a lifetime of unquestioned privilege, "I feel I should warn you that Lady Fairfax has something of a reputation for dramatic behavior. You might want to consider whether association with her is wise for someone in your position." The insult was so blatant, so deliberately cruel, that even the most jaded members of London society drew sharp breaths. But it was Dr. Reed's response that would be remembered and repeated in drawing rooms across the city for weeks to come. "Lord Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, "I have had the privilege of knowing Lady Fairfax for several weeks now, and I have found her to be one of the most intelligent, compassionate, and genuinely admirable women I have ever met. If you consider those qualities to be character flaws, then I fear we have very different definitions of what makes a person worthy of respect." The words fell into the ballroom like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and admiration through the assembled guests. Several people began to applaud, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, until the sound filled the grand space with its approval. Charlotte's face had gone white with fury, while Lord Blackwood looked as though he had been struck. They had clearly expected to humiliate Evangeline once again, to reduce her to the broken woman who had fled from the chapel in shame. Instead, they had witnessed her transformation into someone far stronger than they had ever imagined possible. "Lady Fairfax," Dr. Reed offered his arm with a smile that was both gentle and triumphant. "Shall we go see those artifacts? I believe you'll find the hieroglyphic inscriptions particularly fascinating." As they walked away from the stunned couple, Evangeline felt a lightness in her chest that she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, someone had defended her not because of her family name or her dowry, but because of who she was as a person. More importantly, she had defended herself, had spoken her truth with clarity and courage. "Thank you," she said quietly, as they moved toward the exhibition area that Lady Agatha had arranged in the library. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Dr. Reed replied simply. "No one should be allowed to speak to you that way, regardless of their title or social position. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness, Lady Fairfax. I hope you're beginning to believe that yourself." As they entered the library, where ancient Egyptian artifacts glowed under carefully arranged lighting, Evangeline realized that she was beginning to believe it. More than that, she was beginning to understand that the woman who had been left at the altar was not a victim to be pitied, but a survivor who had been given the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to discover who she truly was when freed from others' expectations. But as she caught sight of Charlotte and Lord Blackwood through the doorway, their heads bent together in urgent conversation, she couldn't shake the feeling that this evening's confrontation was only the beginning. They had been publicly humiliated, their cruelty exposed, before the very society they sought to impress. Such people, she knew, did not forgive or forget easily. What would they do next? And did she have the strength to face whatever storm was coming? The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Lady Agatha's breakfast room, casting golden patterns across the mahogany table where Evangeline sat reading the morning papers with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. 3 days had passed since the charity gala, and London society was still buzzing with accounts of the confrontation between the former bride and her sister. The gossip columns had been particularly creative in their interpretations, with some painting Evangeline as a tragic heroine, and others suggesting that Dr. Reed was merely the latest chapter in what they termed her rebellion against propriety. "Listen to this," Lady Agatha said, looking up from her own paper with obvious amusement. "Lady Whistledown's column describes you as a phoenix rising from the ashes of scandal, her wings spread wide enough to cast shadows over those who sought to diminish her. Rather dramatic, but not entirely inaccurate." Evangeline smiled despite herself, but her attention was drawn to a more serious article on the opposite page. "Aunt, look at this piece about the East End Clinic. It says that several prominent families have withdrawn their financial support following Dr. Reed's inappropriate social climbing at the gala. They're suggesting that his association with me has damaged his reputation among potential benefactors." The smile faded from Lady Agatha's face as she read over her niece's shoulder. "Petty, vindictive creatures," she muttered. "They cannot bear to see someone rise above their station through merit rather than birthright. But Elias is stronger than they imagine, and his work speaks for itself." Before Evangeline could respond, the butler appeared in the doorway with a silver tray bearing a single letter. "For Lady Fairfax," he announced. "The messenger said it was urgent." Evangeline's heart skipped as she recognized the elegant handwriting on the cream-colored envelope. Inside, Dr. Reed's words were carefully chosen, but could not entirely mask his concern. "Dear Lady Fairfax, I hope this letter finds you well. I write to inform you that I have accepted a position with the Royal Geographic Society's upcoming expedition to Egypt. Professor Hartwell has invited me to serve as the expedition's medical officer, a role that will allow me to combine my medical training with my interest in archaeological discovery. We depart in 6 weeks' time. I wanted you to hear this news from me directly, rather than through the gossip networks that seem to follow our every interaction with such keen interest. I also wanted to express my gratitude for the privilege of knowing you these past weeks. Your intelligence, courage, and kindness have been a source of inspiration during what I know has been a difficult time for both of us. I hope you will not think me presumptuous if I say that I believe this expedition represents not just a professional opportunity, but a chance for both of us to write new chapters in our lives, free from the constraints and expectations that have bound us here. If you would be willing to receive me, I should very much like to call upon you this afternoon to discuss this matter further. Your devoted friend, Dr. Elias Reed." Evangeline read the letter twice, her emotions cycling through surprise, admiration, and something that felt dangerously close to panic. "He's leaving for Egypt," she said quietly, handing the letter to Lady Agatha. Her aunt read quickly, her expression growing thoughtful. "A wise man," she said finally. "He recognizes that sometimes the only way to escape a trap is to step outside its boundaries entirely. But his clinic, his patients, he's worked so hard to establish himself here. And he's discovered that his work will always be subject to the whims of people who value social conformity over human compassion," Lady Agatha replied gently. "Sometimes, my dear, the bravest thing we can do is choose our own path, even when it means leaving behind what we thought we wanted." That afternoon, Dr. Reed arrived precisely at the appointed time, his manner composed, but with an underlying tension that spoke of momentous decisions carefully considered. Lady Agatha, with her usual tact, excused herself to attend to correspondence, leaving them alone in the drawing-room where afternoon light filtered through lace curtains. "You're really going to Egypt," Evangeline said without preamble, studying his face for signs of doubt or regret. "I am," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "The expedition represents everything I've dreamed of, the chance to contribute to genuine discovery while providing medical care to people who need it. Professor Hartwell's team will be working with local communities, documenting not just archaeological finds, but the living culture that surrounds them." "It sounds wonderful," Evangeline said, and meant it, though her heart felt strangely heavy. You must be very excited." "I am," Dr. Reed said again, but his eyes never left her face. "But I find myself reluctant to leave London for reasons I hadn't anticipated when I first accepted the position." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither quite dared to voice directly. Evangeline felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Dr. Reed," she began carefully, "if you're concerned about the gossip, about the damage to your reputation—" "I'm not," he interrupted gently. "My reputation will recover, or it won't. What concerns me is the thought of leaving you to face the continued machinations of people like your sister and Lord Blackwood without someone who sees your true worth standing beside you." The simple declaration sent warmth flooding through Evangeline's chest, but it was followed immediately by a cold wash of reality. "You cannot sacrifice your dreams for my sake," she said firmly. "I won't be responsible for holding you back from the life you're meant to live." "What if, Doctor?" Reed said quietly, leaning forward in his chair. "What if I told you that my dreams have changed? What if the life I'm meant to live includes you?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Evangeline felt her heart racing, but beneath the excitement lay a deeper current of fear. "Elias," she said, using his given name for the first time, "you barely know me. We've spent a few weeks in conversation, attended a handful of lectures together. You cannot base such momentous decisions on so brief an acquaintance." "Can't I?" he asked, his voice warm with conviction. "In these few weeks, I've learned more about your character than I might discover about another person in years of conventional courtship. I've seen your intelligence, your compassion, your courage in the face of public humiliation. I've watched you transform from a woman broken by others' cruelty into someone who stands tall in her own truth. If that's not enough foundation for a life together, then I don't know what would be." Evangeline rose from her chair and moved to the window, needing distance to think clearly. Below, the streets of Belgravia bustled with afternoon traffic, carriages and pedestrians going about their daily business, unaware that in this quiet drawing room, 2 lives hung in the balance. "What are you asking me, Elias?" she said without turning around. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said simply. "I'm asking you to come to Egypt as my wife, to build a life with me that's based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than social obligation. I'm asking you to take the greatest leap of faith imaginable, to trust that love can grow from friendship, that partnership can flourish in foreign soil, that 2 people who value truth over convention can create something beautiful together." Evangeline closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down upon her like a physical force. Everything in her upbringing screamed that this was madness. To marry a man she had known for mere weeks, to leave England for the uncertainties of Egypt, to abandon the familiar world of her birth for something entirely unknown. But hadn't that familiar world already abandoned her? Hadn't the conventional path led only to humiliation and heartbreak? And wasn't there something thrilling about the possibility of writing her own story, of choosing love over security, adventure over safety? "The scandal would be enormous," she said finally, turning back to face him. "A woman jilted at the altar, marrying her sister's cast-off suitor's rival within months of the original disaster. Society would never forgive either of us." "Ah, then perhaps," Dr. Reed said, rising to join her at the window, "it's time we stopped caring what society thinks. Perhaps it's time we decided that our happiness matters more than their approval." As he spoke, a carriage drew up outside the house, and Evangeline's heart sank as she recognized the Blackwood coat of arms emblazoned on its door. Charlotte emerged in a rustle of burgundy silk, her face set in lines of determination that Evangeline knew all too well. "It seems," she said quietly, "that we're about to have visitors. Charlotte has come calling, and I suspect her purpose is not entirely social." Dr. Reed followed her gaze, and his expression hardened. "Would you like me to leave? I don't want my presence to make things more difficult for you." "No," Evangeline said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. Stay. Whatever she has come to say, I think it's time I faced it with someone who believes in me standing at my side. D. As the sound of voices drifted up from the entrance hall, Evangeline realized that this moment, this choice between the safety of solitude and the risk of partnership, would define the rest of her life. Charlotte's arrival felt like a test, a final confrontation that would determine whether she had truly found the courage to claim her own destiny. But as she looked into Elias's steady brown eyes, she felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The question was, did she have the courage to say yes to a future that promised everything she had never dared to dream? The answer, she realized, was walking up the stairs toward them, dressed in burgundy silk and armed with the particular cruelty that only family could wield. The Mediterranean sun painted the ancient stones of Alexandria in shades of gold and amber as Evangeline Reed stepped onto the terrace of their villa, her morning tea steaming gently in the warm Egyptian air. 6 months had passed since she and Elias had exchanged vows in the small chapel of Lady Agatha's estate, witnessed only by her beloved aunt and Professor Hartwell, who had served as Elias's best man. The ceremony had been simple, intimate, and utterly perfect. Everything her first wedding was meant to be, but never could have been. The confrontation with Charlotte that December afternoon seemed like a lifetime ago now, though Evangeline could still recall every poisonous word her sister had spoken. Charlotte had arrived at Lady Agatha's house, armed with threats and ultimatums, demanding that Evangeline abandon her ridiculous infatuation with Dr. Reed and return to Yorkshire to live quietly as a spinster aunt, grateful for whatever scraps of family acceptance might be thrown her way. "You're making a fool of yourself," Charlotte had declared, her blue eyes blazing with a fury that revealed just how deeply the charity gala confrontation had wounded her pride. "Running off to Egypt with some nobody doctor, it's beneath even your reduced circumstances. Think of the family name, Evangeline. Think of what people will say." But Evangeline had thought of something else entirely. The warmth in Elias's eyes when he spoke of their future together. The way he listened to her thoughts as though they mattered. The possibility of a life built on mutual respect rather than social obligation. When Charlotte finally departed in a storm of silk and indignation, Evangeline had turned to Elias with a smile that felt like sunrise. "Yes," she had said simply. "Yes to Egypt, yes to adventure, yes to a life we choose together." Now, as she watched the sun rise over the harbour, where feluccas bobbed like white birds on the azure water, Evangeline marvelled at how completely her world had transformed. Their villa, provided by the Royal Geographic Society for the expedition's medical officer and his wife, was modest by the standards of her upbringing, but rich in ways she had never imagined. The walls were lined with books in multiple languages, artifacts from their archaeological work, and sketches she had made of the remarkable people and places they had encountered. "Good morning, my love," Elias's voice came from behind her, warm with the contentment that had become his constant companion since their arrival in Egypt. He joined her on the terrace, his own cup of coffee in hand, his shirt sleeves rolled up in the casual manner that would have scandalized London society, but seemed perfectly natural here. "The sunrise is particularly beautiful this morning," Evangeline replied, leaning into his embrace as naturally as breathing. "I was thinking about the letter we received from Aunt Agatha yesterday. She says London society has moved on to newer scandals, and that our romantic elopement to Egypt has taken on an almost mythical quality in the retelling." Elias chuckled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I suspect Lady Agatha has had a hand in shaping that narrative. She always did have a gift for turning scandal into romance when it suited her purposes. Their life in Alexandria had fallen into a rhythm that felt both purposeful and joyful. Elias spent his days providing medical care to the expedition team and the local workers, while also documenting traditional healing practices that might benefit medical knowledge back in England. Evangeline had discovered an unexpected talent for archaeological illustration, her detailed drawings of hieroglyphs and artifacts earning praise from Professor Hartwell and his colleagues. "Speaking of letters," Elias said, producing an envelope from his pocket, "this arrived with the Morning Post. It's from the Royal Geographic Society." Evangeline felt a flutter of anticipation as she recognized the official seal. Over the past months, Elias had been documenting not just his medical work, but also his observations of Egyptian culture and society, sending detailed reports back to London that had garnered significant attention in academic circles. "Read it aloud," she said, settling into one of the wicker chairs that had become their favorite spot for morning conversations. Elias opened the letter and cleared his throat. "Dr. Reed," he began, "the Society has reviewed your reports with great interest and enthusiasm. Your innovative approach to combining medical practice with anthropological observation has opened new avenues of research that we believe will prove invaluable to future expeditions. We are pleased to offer you the position of Chief Medical Officer for our upcoming expedition to the Sudan, with the understanding that Mrs. Reed's contributions to archaeological documentation have proven equally valuable to our mission." Evangeline's eyes widened as the implications of the letter sank in. "They're offering you a promotion, and they want me to continue my work as well." "It appears," Elias said with a grin that transformed his entire face, "that our unconventional partnership has proven more successful than anyone anticipated. They're not just offering me a position, they're offering us a future together, doing work that matters, in places most people only dream of seeing." As they sat together on the terrace, planning their next adventure, Evangeline's thoughts drifted to the woman she had been just a year ago, the frightened bride in ivory silk, walking toward a future that would have slowly suffocated her spirit. That woman seemed like a stranger now, a character from someone else's story. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Giving up your London practice, leaving behind everything familiar?" Elias set down his coffee and took her hands in his expression serious. "Evangeline, before I met you, I thought I knew what I wanted from life. A successful practice, the respect of my colleagues, a comfortable existence within the boundaries society had set for someone of my background. But you showed me something I had never imagined, the possibility of a partnership where two people could encourage each other to become more than they ever dreamed possible alone." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You didn't just agree to marry me, my love. You agreed to build a life with me that defies every convention we were raised to accept. You've become not just my wife, but my partner, in every sense of the word. How could I regret the choice that led me to you?" Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mahmoud, their young Egyptian assistant, who had become both friend and cultural guide during their time in Alexandria. His face was bright with excitement as he approached the terrace. "Dr. Reed, Mrs. Reed," he called in the careful English they had been helping him perfect. "Professor Hartwell sends word that the new excavation has revealed something extraordinary. He requests your presence immediately." As they gathered their supplies and prepared to join the archaeological team, Evangeline caught sight of herself in the mirror that hung in their bedroom. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the pale, ethereal creature who had once graced London ballrooms. Her skin was golden from the Egyptian sun, her hair had lightened to auburn, shot through with copper highlights, and her green eyes sparkled with the confidence that came from knowing her own worth. More importantly, she was dressed for work, practical cotton clothing that allowed her to move freely, sturdy boots suitable for walking across ancient ruins, and a wide-brimmed hat that protected her from the desert sun. She looked like what she had become, a woman who had chosen her own path and found joy in the walking of it. The excavation site buzzed with excitement as they arrived. The international team of archaeologists and workers gathered around a newly uncovered section of what appeared to be a Ptolemaic-era temple. Professor Hartwell, his beard white with dust and his eyes bright with discovery, hurried to greet them. "Elias, Evangeline," he called, "you must see this. We've uncovered a series of medical papyri, perfectly preserved, that appear to document surgical procedures unknown to modern medicine. And the hieroglyphic inscriptions, Evangeline, your skills will be essential in translating them accurately." Nazilin, as Evangeline knelt beside the ancient texts, her trained eye already beginning to decipher the symbols that told stories of healing and hope from thousands of years past, she felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the ancient scribes who had recorded this knowledge, but to the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a woman whose life was entirely determined by others' expectations. Today, she was a partner in one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the decade, her skills valued and her contributions essential to the work that would preserve this knowledge for future generations. That evening, as she and Elias sat on their terrace watching the stars emerge over the ancient city, Evangeline reflected on the letter she would write to Lady Agatha the next morning. She would tell her aunt about the discovery, about the new expedition to Sudan, about the life she and Elias were building together in the shadow of the pyramids. But most importantly, she would tell her about the woman she had become, not despite the humiliation she had endured at that altar in Yorkshire, but because of it. The bride who had been left standing in ivory silk had died that day, but from her ashes had risen someone far stronger, far braver, far more authentically herself than she had ever imagined possible. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked, following her gaze to the stars that had guided travelers across these deserts for millennia. "I was thinking," Evangeline replied, her voice soft with wonder, "about how sometimes the worst thing that can happen to us turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. If Charlotte and Reginald hadn't betrayed me, if I hadn't been forced to leave everything I thought I wanted behind, I never would have discovered who I truly am. I never would have found you, or this work, or this life we're building together." Elias reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as naturally as breathing. "Do you think they're happy?" he asked. "Charlotte and Lord Blackwood living the life you were meant to have?" Evangeline considered the question, surprised to find that she felt no bitterness, no lingering resentment. "I hope they are," she said finally. "I hope they've found whatever it was they were looking for in each other. But I know now that the life I was meant to have is this one, the one I chose, the one I'm living with you." As the Egyptian night settled around them, filled with the distant sounds of the ancient city and the promise of tomorrow's discoveries, Evangeline Reed closed her eyes and smiled. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover everything you actually needed. And in the shadow of the pyramids, under stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, she had finally learned to bloom exactly where she was planted, in a life of her own choosing, with a love that had grown from friendship into something as enduring as the ancient stones that surrounded them. The bride who had been left at the altar was gone forever, but the woman who had taken her place was exactly who she was always meant to be. If this story of transformation and unexpected love has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, romance, and the power of choosing your own destiny. Share in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment when what seemed like the worst thing that could happen turned out to be exactly what you needed? Your stories inspire us to keep bringing you these journeys of the heart. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we have the courage to turn the page.